Good morning. My name is Volodymyr Koman. I'm the director of MIT.nano. I have a pleasure of hosting another nano exploration seminar. This one is going to be delivered by Volodymyr Koman from Professor Strano's group in chemical engineering. And the topic of it will be electronic cells, autonomous micromachines from 2D materials. As in the previous nano explorations, please hold your questions to the very end. At that point, you can send them to me or everyone else via chat, or by raising your hand, you can ask a question. But without further ado, I'm going to ask Volodymyr to take over.
All right, thank you, Professor Bulovich, for having me here, and I'm very excited to deliver this talk about the electronic cells. This is a recent work that we were been doing in the Strano group and chemical engineering. So just to start with a little bit of motivation, let's have a look at the complexity of nature. And here I will show three pretty simple examples of functions of cells that they are working on. So on the left, we have a white blood cells in the midst of red blood cells, and they are actually hunting bacteria. I don't know whether you guys can see the video. And then in the middle, you have some red blood cells traveling into our vasculature. So some of them are actually patching this wound, while others are traveling and transporting oxygen through the bloodstream. Finally, on the right, you have some network of neurons that have their signal propagation through them, and they are also doing some computation in their body. So all of them represent very, very fascinating functions, and that I must say, they notice that they are autonomous. So for me as an engineer, it's very, very challenging to think how we can build some tools that we have in our hand. So the purpose of our talk would be actually is to how we can make these micro machines that we call electronic cells that will have autonomous functions on board, something similar that we see on these examples of what nature is delivering to us. So just to put things into perspective and in terms of the scale, and to answer a question, why should you care and where it all fits with your research, I just want to show you the scales of, for example, the human body. You have a human digestive system, which is in the scales of centimeters. Here we have blood vasculature and individual cells that are in microscales. But really, to make something functional, there are two schools of thoughts currently present in the literature. So this can be roughly divided into material systems and electronic systems. So let's have a look at the specific examples. So for example, electronic systems are corresponding state-of-the-art swarm robotics. So these are centimeter scale robots that you have thousands of them, and researchers are exploring what would be the emergent behaviors in such kind of systems. Then you have micro robotics. So here you see an example of the mini drone capable of flying at the tip of the finger. Then you have ingestible sensors to explore and sense our digestive systems. And finally, you have some concepts of the smart dust. So this is the electronics in the millimeter scale. All of this, on top of this, a part of the smart dust, are really a centimeter scale. That's why these systems are actually here to the right. On the left, what we call a material approach. We can see that there is molecular machines. So this is just a bunch of atoms assembled in the form of a sports car, and you can excite it with the STM tip and they will move through the atoms. Then you have something that researchers call nanorobots. So these are stimuli responsive materials, usually targeted for locomotion. You have biorobots. So this is an assembly of nanomaterials with bacteria. And you have something like this drug release particles, core shell particles, and so on. So these are usually stimuli responsive materials targeted for the drug release, cargo delivery, and so on. So these are not an exhaustive list, but you can notice that these things are usually either in nanoscale or then microscale. And comparing, contrasting these two, you can immediately notice some differences and some things in common, and some specific things that hold true for these material systems and electronic systems. So let's have a look on them. So first of all, for material systems, the fabrication is scalable in terms of all the volumes. Fabrication is also pretty simple very often. In contrast, electronic systems are characterized by precise processes, and also they are very often related to the foundry lab or clean room fabrication. The next step is, I would argue that material systems are very often can be viewed as energy efficient as compared to the electronic systems. And in contrast, material systems are not modular versus electronic systems are modular. And finally, materials have very often limited functions, while electronic systems can be reconfigurable if you think about the hundreds of transistors and their computational power. Just to give you an example to really highlight the latest three comparisons, let's have a look at the case study of temperature swallowable microparticles. So these are microscale swallowable gel, and they change their size with temperature. So they as you heat them, they shrink, and then as we cool them down, they expand. So if you just draw a circuit equivalent circuit diagram for these particles, it will look in the following way. It turns out that the particle is pretty complex. It has the built-in the temperature sensor and the comparator circuit. And if the temperature exceeds this threshold temperature, right, the particle starts to harvest energy from the ambient energy bath and actuates the actuator, either to shrink or to expand. So if an engineer would actually ask to build this kind of system, right, it would, at this micro scale, it would be rather complex, because you need to integrate all of these components. On the other hand, for material sciences, it's pretty simple to make this hydrogel. However, in contrast, this hydrogel is not modular. In a sense, if I ask a material scientist to change now temperature sensor to pH sensor, he will say, oh, I need to redesign this material completely because we need to take the material, completely different material. So in that sense, these systems, material systems, are not modular as compared to the electronic systems. However, they are more energy efficient because everything is tightly integrated together. So in a sense, electronic systems, if we want to scale down below the millimeter scale and actually push the boundary into the smaller range of the cells, of the biological cells, they would lack autonomy. So here I'm showing the example of the chip, right? The electronic components can be even at the nanoscale. However, you see that to actually drive these components, you have to have an external power delivered, because these things are simply energy inefficient. So this kind of chip would actually lack autonomy to operate on their own. And so hence it cannot rival their biological counterparts. In contrast, microparticles and nanoparticles, they can be integrated and they can be functioning as these complex machines. However, they will have very limited processing capabilities as we want to scale them down. If you think and compare them to, for example, hundreds of transistors, right, in terms of the processing capabilities. So here we have these two different boundaries, and they actually complement each other. And that's why electronic cells we envision to operate in this space in between, in terms of the size, but also in terms of the functionalities. So we envision electronic cells to combine best of these two worlds of material and electronic advances. And the idea is to have the autonomous micromachines that complete a specific task. And so the idea to have autonomous is crucial is because, well, to make sure that the dummy chip with a bunch of electronics but no power will not count to this pursuit. And also to achieve a specific task, because we want to determine a task and then setting the task will actually give you a figure of merit to whether you are, how successful you are in achieving this task. So how do we actually do these electronic cells? So our vision is to combine the polymeric core, so basically core shell microscale particle, with the 2D electronics that can be fashioned into the electronic skin circuits on top of these particles. So in this sense, we can combine both the nanoelectronics plus some efficiency and some additional functions from our polymeric core. And so we are excited about the 2D materials because you have a whole arsenal of 2D materials, starting from the conductors to semiconductors and insulators. And they are also great because you can have tunable electronic properties, you can stack them together, and they are also mechanically flexible. That is very, very important, as you will see later on. And just to get us motivated further, we asked the question why we would need these kind of machines, electronic cells. And it turns out that accessing the enclosed environments is proving to be very, very difficult to achieve with the solutions that are available on the market nowadays. So these kind of microscale machines would be really an ideal fit for these things. And once you are in the enclosed environment, right, once you have very small particle, what do you want to do there? Well, we already have a lot of, like I mentioned briefly about the drug release particles, right? They are capable of performing very simple functions of, let's say, delivery drug. But what we want to achieve is something that is currently very difficult to achieve with them, and this is to have this sensing and recording capabilities. We realize that recording capabilities is very difficult to achieve with material science approach versus it's very easy to achieve with the electronic approach, right? We all have our cell phones, our computers that have tons of memory nowadays. So to put this into perspective of the actual application, well, first of all, it's a biomedical. Humanity have a long-standing dream of having these micro and nano robots operating in our bodies to perform sensing and micro and nano surgeries. So this would be an exciting direction to go. But also much more accessible places we identify is, for example, monitoring the extended pipelines. So if you have if you want to determine whether your pipe is leaking and you have the pipeline running for thousands of miles, or if somebody is smuggling oil or smuggling gas through the pipeline, usually it's done through the manual inspection or in base case scenario through drone inspection. So it's very labor intensive and very costly. So imagine if you would have these particles that are so small that they are so cheap that you can just inject them at one end and retrieve at the other end, and they would have recorded all the information that is happening inside your pipeline. And you can do it continuously, right? Running them through the pipeline because they are so cheap. And finally, if you have more extended pipelines in terms of the bio and pharma and chemical plants, where you have complex flow pattern occurring, and you don't have any kind of way to check what is the pattern occurring there without disturbing this pattern. So current solutions here are injecting, placing inside the bulky mechanical probes and electrical probes that necessarily disturb the system's equilibrium and balance. Imagine if you would have an ability to actually inject small cells inside to sense and record the environment inside this enclosed environments. So with this, how do we actually make electronic cells? And in Strano Group, we recently developed two different ways. So one is a top-down approach based on the clean room approaches. and the other one is a bottom-up that relies on the self-assembly and the material approach. Today, I'll be talking about the first top-down approach that I've recently developed. So it all starts in the clean room, and it all starts with the polymer particles. So in this case, we are using SU8 base. So we can, using the photolithography, we can fashion it in different shapes and sizes. And once it's cross-linked, it's mechanically and chemically stable. So you can then transfer your electronics on top. So here we are using 2D materials, MOS2 and WC2. So for our electronics and some contact metallic layers. So all of this is deposited by transfer and then defined by photolithography. And then we do some more additional steps of photolithography to add additional components. And later on, we just etch out our wafer and we can release this particle into the environment and we have a dispersed solution. So this is just the top view, rather complex particle, but I will walk you through this. This is just a short video of how you have these particles on the wafer and then they are being released into the environments. Unfortunately, yeah, due to Zoom, I don't see the animation playing on my screen, so apologies for this. But basically, the particle has three components. One is the photodiode, so this is the heterojunction of MOS2 and WC2 PN 2D materials. Then we have a chemiresistor, so this is a 2D material of MOS2. And then we have a memristor, so this is MOS2 flakes sandwiched together. And we chose these components not arbitrarily, but they actually form what we call a state machine. So this is a very simple state machine when you have a memory state, which is an off state. But if you have a presence of analyte and you have a presence of light, the memory will switch to the on state. So this particle has the ability to remember events with certain logic capabilities. So there is a logical end here. When you have both of these stimuli, the particle will remember this. So in a sense, we are sensing and recording. So how does it work? So first of all, when we are shining light on our photodiode, it generates certain photocurrent, right? So as you can see here from this current voltage diagram, as this photocurrent goes and powers our chemiresistor, and our chemiresistor reacts with our soot. We will be talking why we are interested in detection of the soot, but basically soot changes the conductivity of our chemiresistor, and this allows to have the memristor actually increase the voltage drop across the memristor. And so the memristor is the electrical element that has the following characteristic. It has two conductivity states. And as you increase the voltage over the threshold voltage here, which is around 0.15, 0.2 volts, your memristor will change its conductivity states. And that's how we can actually differentiate whether our particle was written or not written. We start from the off state here, and then we end up at the on state here if it's written. So putting all this together, we are introducing what we call aerosolizable electronics. So we are interested in dispersing these particles in the enclosed environments and understanding how they behave in these enclosed environments. And for this, we developed this kind of enclosed pipeline where we are introducing our electronic cells. And then we are spraying them using this nebulizer across this chamber. And we are basically capturing them on the other side of the chamber on this target. In the typical experiment, we usually have hundreds of them showing isotropical pattern on them, so showing that really we observe a neutron buoyancy of these electronic cells. So, and I would like just to draw your attention that this environment is pretty harsh, right? Because these particles are undergoing this turbulent distortion during propulsion. So we were interested in whether actually electronics, onboard electronics, survives this. And so we tested these electronic cells in 3 conditions: on the substrate as fabricated, after liftoff in the solution, and after spraying. And this is just the performance for the chemiresistor, where you see the initial versus final conductance. And you can see that all 3 different conditions are falling in the same line. It means that actually 2D materials survive this harsh process of aerosolization. So this is great, but now let's come back to our state machine operations, right? And whether we can actually achieve these operations in this platform. So to check this, while we were spraying our electronic cells, we also sprayed soot, and so allowed the cells to react with the soot environment. And soot is very important because it's very important in terms of the climate change, right? And in terms of the carbon emission. However, detection of soot is very, very challenging, as it can travel thousands and thousands of miles. And so the cost of deployment of sensing network is very, very large to actually detect soot. So if you would have something very small and something very cheap that can actually detect soot, this would be very nice. So coming back to our performance, here's the results. So we start with our cells on this memristor conductance state, which is non-written. So it starts over here. And once we have the reaction with soot, our chemiresistor changes its conductance, and we go to this quadrant. And then our memristor actually retains this information on board, which corresponds to this quadrant. So you can see actually that our machines respond to spec, and they are able not only to sense the environment, but also to record, and later we can read out what is the recording of the environment. In very other application, but yeah, still very interesting, is the idea is actually to disperse these electronic cells over extended surfaces, and then to later on check whether they respond to soot. And so what we did here, we have this extended surface where we locally sprayed some patterns of soot. And this is again the result of the comparison between the initial state of our electronic cells and then the exposed state of our electronic cells. So our chemiresistor conductance is just our check, just to make sure that the sensor reacts and works. But what we are finally reading out is only the memristor conductance. So you can see how this state goes from here to here. And to show you the spatial correspondence, you can see that these clusters of electronic cells that actually reacted, they are clustered around the places where we actually sprayed our soot. So this is a great result demonstrating that we can actually record this information on board and use the sensing and also recording to retrieve the information. But later on, once you spray these particles into extended pipeline, extended system, or over your surface, you actually are interested in recovery. So to do this, yeah, sorry, I have, okay, yeah, we have one question on chat, but we'll get to this later. So to actually get the recovery, we developed this optoelectronic system where we have a laser that is raster scanning through our surface. And we equipped our electronic sensors with these checker devices where you have this polymer shape in this checkered form and coated with the reflective silver red layer. And this follows the retrorefractive principle, and it is able to reflect incident light at the same angle as the incoming light. And it follows this retroreflector that you have in your bikes. So if we measure the reflecting at non-incident angles, you can see that these particles are really reflecting at various angles of inclination. And this is in comparison to this diffuse reflective limit. So if you would have just a particle that doesn't have this reflectance, At non-incident angles, you would be somewhere here, but we have pretty high reflectivities. So this allows us to find these particles even at non-planar surfaces. So for example, in this video, I'm applying the particles on the layer of leaf, and then I'm just showing the raster scanning with my laser. And as a result, we are getting this kind of image where these bright spots correspond to the electronic cells. So once you detect them, you can later on fish them out and read out them. So in this first approach, what we are doing is the readout is actually physical. Versus that once we identify the cells, we actually go with our probes and read out what is the state of our memory. But we also working on the approaches where the particle can later on send the information to us. And so as a result, we are merging these materials and electronic approaches and using the advances of both worlds. Today, I just showed you how we developed this autonomous micro machine that has some autonomous functions on board. And I would like to thank all of the group. Thank you for your attention. Thank you especially for our subgroup that is working on this: Albert, Pingwei, Jinfeng, Git, Sanyan, Alan. We are part of NURI effort at MIT that are working on these electronic cells. But I just want to notice we have an amazing team. I also would like to thank to our collaborators, but also you, if you are working, I would like just to tap into MIT talent that we are having here on board. If you are working on the material systems, but also on low power electronics circuitry, we would be very interested in connecting with you and thinking how we can actually bring these things together into the next generation of electronic cells and to make more and more complex circuits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. That was a really exciting talk. If you have questions based on what you've just seen, yes, of course, there's one more thing we should all do. If you have a reaction, of course, you should provide it. But if you have questions about the talk, please go ahead and send them. I will just start with a simple question. So the chemosensitive element, of course, is able to detect soot. Now, soot itself, you're generating in a specific way, and I'm just wondering, what is that? How are you making soot? And then secondly, what is the chemosensitivity? How selective is it for your particular chemical versus other chemicals you might encounter?
Yeah, so in this case, we were very interested in just proof of demonstration. So we used actually industrial graded soot, and then we also just made a dispersion out of it. So to make a very small dispersion out of that, we had to stabilize it with certain surfactants, and then we spray them around into the environment. And just to answer your second question, yeah, this particular sensor is not very selective. It's just based on the change in the conductivity. And we were very interested in the demonstration of proof of concept. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we are very much interested in much more selective sensors. And I would say the strengths of this approach is that you can have a reversible sensor, right? You can have a reversible sensor that can then be stored into the memory, versus if you would just have irreversible. Well, you can of course have an irreversible sensor, the particle that has irreversible sensor. But if you have a reversible sensor and then you're working now on the array of the memory elements, right? The dream is to have one reversible sensor that can query it multiple times and record multiple things. So yeah, selectivity of the sensor, we are working towards this, but also like just scaling the system towards this and then it will be much clearer that the strengths of this, why we want to have a memory element, because now it's really much a prototype. Yeah.
Okay. Again, if you have a question, please feel free to submit it via chat, or you can raise your hand and hopefully I'll notice and call upon you. Let me then ask another question regarding the memristor itself. It's not a usual electronic element. Certainly people have talked about memristors. You kind of casually mentioned it in your talk. Can you tell us more about the memristor itself? How do you make it?
Yeah, so we are building on somebody else's work. So this is advanced on the field. I think, yeah, the memristors are definitely new. I would say they're slowly coming in, and thanks for putting this out, because I think it's very exciting technology that is coming out on board. So in this particular work, and memristor is made out of MOS2 flakes. And if you just take MOS2 flakes and then treat them with oxygen, what you will have a self-limiting nanometer scale oxygen layer that, acts as a dielectric layer in this case. And then you sandwich this in between the two metals of different work functions. So basically this dielectric layer is basically can later on has certain vacancies that can capture your electrons and change its conductivity. So once the threshold voltage is exceeds in this device, right? All the vacancies are populated, and then your device turns on into the low conductivity state. So it's very, very nice system. We really like it.
Let me ask you one question from the chat regarding the how would you actually communicate with the electronic cell remotely? You have shown us that you can remotely read them out using a laser, but are there additional elements you can imagine doing, sending signals, informing it, and then waiting for its response back?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a couple of ideas there, right? So for example, even this retroreflector that I talked about, this is in a sense having a light in and light out, but you can have something that will modulate the reflectivity of the device, and this is we think it's a cheap way of doing it. We definitely looked and are looking continuously into the LEDs, and in the LEDs I would say is great. However, right now we see that the energy balance is not working out, because to get the light in is one efficiency, but to get the light out is much more expensive. So we would really appreciate the help of engineers there if there are LEDs that are very, very low efficiency, low power. This would be very great to couple it to the device. But I would say this is very important and ongoing subject.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the chat. Is the memristor state reversible, or does it have to be replaced once turned on?
Yeah, so it's reversible. So you can, by reversing the voltage later on, you can just erase it and reuse the particles. But basically for recording, I also have this question very often, is that recording is pretty stable. So basically once you turn on the memristor, the retention time is pretty long. We tested for a couple of hours, and certainly can go longer. So it's very, very neat element.
Yeah, wonderful. Volodymyr, I guess just one more question came in. Let's see. I did not see a moving element in a colloidal state machine. Let's see. Could you elaborate on how the retroreflector is realized?
Yeah, sure. Is it other two questions?
Well, in a way, it appears, yes.
Okay. So yeah. So
actually, Jiwan, are you going to just ask the question directly? Because I'm probably misinterpreted. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this inspiring presentation. So I was actually was wondering, in the previous when you mentioned the photodiode chemiresistor memristor system, I didn't really see a moving element that could possibly be this mirror that is doing the retroreflection. Is this a different like a second generation of the system, or am I missing something in the previous?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, so I haven't showed it like integrated on top of each other, but basically retroreflectors can be basically integrated on the same base on the side of this system. So you can imagine these three elements on the side, you will have retroreflectors, or it can be on the other side of the particle as well. And the idea how it's being realized is basically we make this checker devices using the SU8 polymer, using the photolithography. You can have these side walls 10 micrometer height, 10 micrometer wide, and later on you just coat it using a reflective layer of silver. Yeah, but a good point. I haven't showed it like integrated all together.
I see. Thank you for the clarification. It's really awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, indeed, Volodymyr, this was a truly awesome talk. Thank you so much for indeed giving it to us. At this point, will conclude this nano explorations talk, and I would invite you to join us next week. Tuesday and Thursday, 11 o'clock, there'll be more great science and technology presented to you. All right. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.